Section 4 of The Adventures of Old Mr. Toad. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. Chapter 13. Peter Rabbit is Impolite. Peter Rabbit couldn't get Old Mr. Toad off his mind. He had discovered so many interesting things about Old Mr. Toad that he was almost on the point of believing him to be the most interesting of all his neighbors. And his respect for Old Mr. Toad had become very great indeed. Of course, who wouldn't respect any one with such beautiful eyes and such a sweet voice and such a wonderful tongue? Yet at the same time Peter felt very foolish whenever he remembered that all his life he had been acquainted with Old Mr. Toad without really knowing him at all. There was one comforting thought, and that was that most of his neighbors were just as ignorant regarding Old Mr. Toad as Peter had been.
"Funny,"
mused Peter,
"how we can live right beside people all our lives and not really know them at all. I suppose that is why we should never judge people hastily. I believe I will go hunt up Old Mr. Toad and see if I can find out anything more."
Off started Peter, lipperty-lipperty-lip. He didn't know just where to go, now that Old Mr. Toad had left the Smiling Pool, but he had an idea that he would not be far from their meeting place of the day before, when Old Mr. Toad had explained about his wonderful tongue. But when he got there, Peter found no trace of Old Mr. Toad. You see, it had rained the day before, and that is just the kind of weather that a Toad likes best for traveling. Peter ought to have thought of that, but he didn't. He hunted for a while and finally gave it up and started up the Crooked Little Path with the idea of running over for a call on Johnny Chuck in the Old Orchard. Jolly, round, bright Mr. Sun was shining his brightest, and Peter soon forgot all about Old Mr. Toad. He scampered along up the Crooked Little Path, thinking of nothing in particular but how good it was to be alive, and occasionally kicking up his heels for pure joy. He had just done this when his ears caught the sound of a queer noise a little to one side of the Crooked Little Path. Instantly Peter stopped and sat up to listen. There it was again, and it seemed to come from under an old piece of board. It was just a little rustling sound, hard to be heard. "There's some one under that old board," thought Peter, and peeped under. All he could see was that there was something moving. Instantly Peter was all curiosity. Whoever was there was not very big, he was sure of that. Of course, that meant that he had nothing to fear. So what do you think Peter did? Why, he just pulled that old board over, and when he did that he saw whom do you think? Why, Old Mr. Toad, to be sure. But such a sight as Old Mr. Toad was! Peter just stared. For a full minute he couldn't find his voice. Old Mr. Toad was changing his clothes. Yes, Sir, that is just what Old Mr. Toad was doing. He was taking off his old suit, and under it was a brand new one. But such a time as he was having! He was opening and shutting his big mouth and drawing his hind legs under him and rubbing them against his body. Then Peter saw a strange thing. He saw that Old Mr. Toad's old suit had split in several places, and he was getting it off by sucking it into his mouth. In a few minutes his hind legs were free of the old suit, and little by little it began to be pulled free from his body. All the time Old Mr. Toad was working very hard to suck it at the corners of his big mouth. He glared angrily at Peter, but he couldn't say anything because his mouth was too full. He looked so funny that Peter just threw himself on the ground and rolled over and over with laughter. This made Old Mr. Toad glare more angrily than ever, but he couldn't say anything, not a word. When he had got his hands free by pulling the sleeves of his old coat off inside out, he used his hands to pull the last of it over his head. Then he gulped very hard 2 or 3 times to swallow his old suit, and when the last of it had disappeared, he found his voice. Don't you know that it is the most impolite thing in the world to look at people when they are changing their clothes?" he sputtered. Chapter 14 Old Mr. Toad Disappears. Admit your fault when you've done wrong, and don't postpone it overlong. Peter Rabbit didn't blame Old Mr. Toad a bit for being indignant because Peter had watched him change his suit. It wasn't a nice thing to do. Old Mr. Toad had looked very funny while he was struggling out of his old suit, and Peter just couldn't help laughing at him. But he realized that he had been very impolite, and he very meekly told Old Mr. Toad so.
"You see, it was this way," explained Peter. "I heard something under that old board, and I just naturally turned it over to find out what was there."
"Humph!" grunted Old Mr. Toad.
"I didn't have the least idea that you were there," continued Peter. "When I found who it was and what you were doing, I couldn't help watching because it was so interesting. And I couldn't help laughing because you really did look so funny. But I'm sorry, Mr. Toad. Truly I am. I didn't mean to be so impolite. I promise never to do it again. I don't suppose, Mr. Toad, that it seems at all wonderful to you that you could change your suit that way, but it does to me. I had heard that you swallowed your old suits, but I never half believed it. Now I know it is so, and just how you do it, and I feel as if I had learned something worth knowing. Do you know, I think you are one of the most interesting and wonderful of all my neighbors, and I'll never laugh at or tease you again, Mr. Toad."
"Humph!" grunted Old Mr. Toad again, but it was very clear that he was a little flattered by Peter's interest in him and was rapidly recovering his good nature.
"There's one thing I don't understand yet," said Peter, "and that is where you go to sleep all winter. Do you go down into the mud at the bottom of the Smiling Pool the way Grandfather Frog does?"
"Certainly not," retorted Old Mr. Toad. "Use your common sense, Peter Rabbit. If I had spent the winter in the Smiling Pool, do you suppose I would have left it to come way up here and then have turned right around and gone back there to sing? I'm not so fond of long journeys as all that."
"That's so." Peter looked foolish. "I didn't think of that when I spoke."
"The trouble with you, and with a lot of other people, is that you speak first and do your thinking afterward, when you do any thinking at all," grunted Old Mr. Toad. "Now, if I wanted to, I could disappear right here."
"You mean that you would hide under that old board just as you did before," said Peter with a very wise look.
"Nothing of the sort," snapped Old Mr. Toad. "I could disappear and not go near that old board, not a step nearer than I am now." Peter looked in all directions carefully, but not a thing could he see under which Old Mr. Toad could possibly hide except the old board, and he had said he wouldn't hide under that.
"I don't like to doubt your word, Mr. Toad," said he, "but you'll have to show me before I can believe that."
Old Mr. Toad's eyes twinkled. Here was a chance to get even with Peter for watching him change his suit. "If you'll turn your back to me and look straight down the Crooked Little Path for 5 minutes, I'll disappear," said he. "More than that, I give you my word of honor that I will not hop 3 feet from where I am sitting."
"All right," replied Peter promptly, turning his back to Old Mr. Toad. "I'll look down the Crooked Little Path for 5 minutes and promise not to peek." So Peter sat and gazed straight down the Crooked Little Path. It was a great temptation to roll his eyes back and peep behind him, but he had given his word that he wouldn't, and he didn't. When he thought the 5 minutes were up, he turned around. Old Mr. Toad was nowhere to be seen. Peter looked hastily this way and that way, but there was not a sign of Old Mr. Toad. He had disappeared as completely as if he never had been there. Chapter 15 Old Mr. Toad Gives Peter a Scare.
If you play pranks on other folks, you may be sure that they will take the first chance that they get a joke on you to play. Old Mr. Toad was getting even with Peter for laughing at him. While Peter's back had been turned, Old Mr. Toad had disappeared. It was too much for Peter. Look as he would, he couldn't see so much as a chip under which Old Mr. Toad might have hidden, excepting the old board, and Old Mr. Toad had given his word of honor that he wouldn't hide under that. Nevertheless, Peter hopped over to it and turned it over again, because he couldn't think of any other place to look. Of course, Old Mr. Toad wasn't there. Of course not. He had given his word that he wouldn't hide there, and he always lives up to his word. Peter should have known better than to have looked there. Old Mr. Toad had also said that he would not go 3 feet from the spot where he was sitting at the time, so Peter should have known better than to have raced up the Crooked Little Path as he did. But if Old Mr. Toad had nothing to hide under, of course he must have hopped away, reasoned Peter. He couldn't hop far in 5 minutes, that was sure, and so Peter ran this way and that way a great deal farther than it would have been possible for Old Mr. Toad to have gone. But it was a wholly useless search, and presently Peter returned and sat down on the very spot where he had last seen Old Mr. Toad. Peter never had felt more foolish in all his life. He began to think that Old Mr. Toad must be bewitched and had some strange power of making himself invisible. For a long time Peter sat perfectly still, trying to puzzle out how Old Mr. Toad had disappeared. But the more he puzzled over it, the more impossible it seemed. And yet Old Mr. Toad had disappeared. Suddenly Peter gave a frightened scream and jumped higher than he had ever jumped before in all his life. A voice, the voice of Old Mr. Toad himself, had said, "Well, now are you satisfied?" And that voice had come from right under Peter. Do you wonder that he was frightened? When he turned to look, there sat Old Mr. Toad right where he himself had been sitting a moment before. Peter rubbed his eyes and stared very foolishly. "Well, where did you come from?" he stammered at last. Old Mr. Toad grinned. "I'll show you," said he, and right while Peter was looking at him, he began to sink down into the ground until only the top of his head could be seen. Then that disappeared. Old Mr. Toad had gone down, and the sand had fallen right back over him. Peter just had to rub his eyes again. He had to. Then, to make sure, he began to dig away the sand where Old Mr. Toad had been sitting. In a minute he felt Old Mr. Toad, who at once came out again. Old Mr. Toad's beautiful eyes twinkled more than ever. "I guess we are even now, Peter," said he. Peter nodded. "More than that, Mr. Toad, I think you have a little the best of it," he replied. "Now, won't you tell me how you did it?" Old Mr. Toad held up one of his stout hind feet, and on it was a kind of spur. "There's another just like that on the other foot," said he, "and I use them to dig with. You go into a hole head first, but I go in the other way. I make my hole in soft earth and back into it at the same time, this way." He began to work his stout hind feet, and as he kicked the earth out, he backed in at the same time. When he was deep enough, the earth just fell back over him, for you see it was very loose and not packed down at all. When he once more reappeared, Peter thanked him. Then he asked one more question. "Is that the way you go into winter quarters?" Old Mr. Toad nodded. "And it's the way I escape from my enemies." Chapter 16. Jimmy Skunk is Surprised. Jimmy Skunk ambled along the Crooked Little Path down the hill. He didn't hurry because Jimmy doesn't believe in hurrying. The only time he ever hurries is when he sees a fat beetle trying to get out of sight. Then Jimmy does hurry, but just now he didn't see any fat beetles, although he was looking for them. So he just ambled along as if he had all the time in the world, as indeed he had. He was feeling very good-natured, was Jimmy Skunk, and why shouldn't he? There was everything to make him feel good-natured. Summer had arrived to stay. On every side he heard glad voices. Bumble the bee was humming a song. Best of all, Jimmy had found 3 beetles that very morning, and he knew that there were more if he could find them. So why shouldn't he feel good? Jimmy had laughed at Peter Rabbit for being so anxious for summer to arrive, but he was just as glad as Peter that she had come, although he wouldn't have said so for the world. His sharp little eyes twinkled as he ambled along, and there wasn't much that they missed. As he walked, he talked, quite to himself, of course, because there was nobody near to hear, and this is what he was saying. "Beetle, beetle, smooth and smug, you are nothing but a bug. Bugs are made for skunks to eat, so come out from your retreat. Hello! There's a nice big piece of bark over there that looks as if it ought to have a dozen fat beetles under it. It's great fun to pull over pieces of bark and see the beetles run all ways at once. I'll just have to see what is under that piece." Jimmy tiptoed softly over to the big piece of bark, and then as he made ready to turn it over, he began again that foolish little verse. "Beetle, beetle, smooth and smug, you are nothing but a bug." As he said the last word, he suddenly pulled the piece of bark over. "Who's a bug?" asked a funny voice, and it sounded rather cross. Jimmy Skunk nearly tumbled over backward in surprise, and for a minute he couldn't find his tongue. There, instead of the fat beetles he had been so sure of, sat Old Mr. Toad, and he didn't look at all pleased. "Who's a bug?" he repeated. Instead of answering, Jimmy Skunk began to laugh. "Who's a bug?" demanded Old Mr. Toad more crossly than before. "There isn't any bug, Mr. Toad, and I beg your pardon," replied Jimmy, remembering his politeness. "I just thought there was. You see, I didn't know you were under that piece of bark. I hope you will excuse me, Mr. Toad. Have you seen any fat beetles this morning?" "No," said Old Mr. Toad grumpily, and yawned and rubbed his eyes. "Why," exclaimed Jimmy Skunk, "I believe you have just waked up." "What if I have?" demanded Old Mr. Toad. "Oh, nothing at all, Mr. Toad," replied Jimmy Skunk. "Only you are the second one I've met this morning who had just waked up." "Who was the other?" asked Old Mr. Toad. "Mr. Blacksnake," replied Jimmy. "He inquired for you." Old Mr. Toad turned quite pale. I think I'll be moving along," said he. End of section 4.